What my daughter-in-law Rebecca didn't know when she handed me a dirty broom as my 70th birthday gift in front of 30 guests was that I'd spent 42 years as one of the most ruthless corporate litigation attorneys in Chicago, specializing in destroying families who thought they could steal inheritance through manipulation and fraud. And this time, I was going to use every legal weapon I'd mastered to show her that insulting someone who'd built her career on obliterating greedy relatives was the most catastrophic mistake of her pathetic, gold-digging life. Before I tell you how my own family learned that humiliating a retired attorney who had never lost a case involving inheritance disputes can land you homeless and financially ruined, tell me where you're watching from. And if this story of birthday betrayal and legal justice makes your blood boil the way it should, make sure you smash that subscribe button, because tomorrow, I have another incredible story of family greed that will absolutely leave you speechless. My name is Margaret Maggie Thornfield. I'm 70 years old, and I'm about to tell you how my son's wife Rebecca, a woman who had wormed her way into my family and spent 3 years positioning herself to steal my estate, thought she could publicly humiliate me at my own birthday celebration like I was nothing more than an unpaid maid, only to discover that the frail elderly woman she saw as an easy target was actually a retired senior partner at Thornfield, Morrison Associates, one of Chicago's most prestigious law firms, who had spent 4 decades systematically destroying people. You see, when people looked at me that evening at the Riverside Country Club, celebrating what should have been a joyful milestone birthday, they saw exactly what Rebecca saw: a 70-year-old widow with silver hair pinned back in a simple chignon, wearing a modest navy dress from Nordstrom and sensible low heels, someone who asked for help reading the small print on menus and seemed confused by the younger generation's constant phone use. They saw someone who represented a bygone era, someone who probably didn't understand modern family dynamics or the complex financial realities that drove today's relationships. The truth was, I had cultivated this image carefully and deliberately. To most observers, I appeared to be what society expected from a woman of my age: quiet, deferential, perhaps a little confused by technology, and certainly dependent on younger family members for guidance and support. This perception wasn't accidental. It was a strategic choice that had served me well in both my professional and personal life. People, particularly those with questionable intentions, revealed their true nature when they believed they were dealing with someone who posed no threat to their plans. They became careless with their words, sloppy with their schemes, and overconfident in their ability to manipulate situations to their advantage. This psychological tendency had been invaluable during my legal career, and it was proving equally useful in retirement, as I observed the true character of family members who thought I was too old and naive to understand their motivations. Rebecca had been watching me with calculating eyes for 3 years, observing my apparent frailty during holiday gatherings, noting my requests for help with technology, and carefully documenting what she believed were signs of cognitive decline that could be exploited when the time came to challenge my will or manipulate my estate planning decisions. What she saw was a widow living alone in a large house that was probably too much for her to maintain, struggling with smartphone apps that confused her, and asking family members to explain financial documents that seemed to overwhelm her aging mind. During Christmas dinner 2 years ago, I had deliberately asked Rebecca to help me understand a bank statement that showed several large transactions. As she leaned over my shoulder to examine the document, I watched her eyes widen as she calculated the amounts involved and began to grasp the scope of assets she believed she might eventually inherit through her marriage to my son David. "Oh, Margaret, this does look complicated," Rebecca had said with syrupy sweetness, though I could see the greed practically glowing in her eyes. "Maybe David and I should help you organize your finances so nothing important gets overlooked." The suggestion that I needed help organizing finances that I had been managing successfully for over 50 years was both insulting and revealing. Rebecca wasn't offering assistance out of genuine concern for my welfare. She was fishing for information about my assets while positioning herself as an indispensable helper who could gradually assume control over financial decisions I was supposedly too confused to handle myself. But what Rebecca didn't know, what she'd never bothered to investigate despite 3 years of scheming, was that the woman she saw as a confused elderly widow had actually been one of the most feared litigators in Illinois, someone who had built her reputation by taking apart families who thought they could manipulate inheritance laws to steal from relatives they considered weak or vulnerable. The law firm of Thornfield, Morrison & Associates hadn't gotten its reputation by accident. We specialized in high-stakes family litigation, estate disputes, and inheritance fraud cases that required not just legal expertise, but psychological understanding of how greed and family dynamics created opportunities for manipulation and theft. Our client base included some of the wealthiest families in the Midwest, people whose substantial assets made them targets for relatives, caregivers, and supposed friends who saw elderly family members as stepping stones to financial security. Over my 42-year career, I had seen every possible variation of family greed and manipulation. Adult children who convinced elderly parents to sign over properties for tax purposes and then refused to transfer them back. Grandchildren who isolated elderly relatives from other family members while systematically draining their bank accounts. Caregivers who manipulated confused seniors into changing wills and beneficiary designations. Spouses who married elderly widows and widowers, specifically to gain access to estates they had never contributed to building. In each case, the perpetrators shared certain characteristics that made them both predictable and ultimately defeatable. They underestimated their elderly targets. Assuming that age automatically meant vulnerability and confusion, they became overconfident in their schemes, believing that their methods were too sophisticated for elderly victims to understand or counter. Most importantly, they documented their crimes through communications, financial transactions, and behavioral patterns that could be traced and used as evidence in legal proceedings. The irony was so perfect it would have been amusing if it weren't so personally devastating. Rebecca thought I was struggling with modern life because I was old and out of touch, when the reality was that I understood family law, estate planning, and inheritance disputes at a level that would make most attorneys feel inadequate. I knew how to trace hidden assets through offshore accounts, how to prove financial fraud in family transactions, how to document patterns of elder manipulation, and how to build legal cases that would destroy families who thought they had covered their tracks completely. My expertise extended far beyond simple legal knowledge. During my career, I had developed relationships with private investigators, forensic accountants, and family law specialists who could uncover evidence that most people didn't even know existed. I understood how to analyze spending patterns, communication records, and behavioral changes that indicated when elderly family members were being manipulated or exploited. I knew how to present complex evidence in ways that judges and juries could understand and apply, and I had never lost a case involving family members who had tried to steal inheritance through fraud or manipulation. But perhaps most importantly, I had learned early in my legal career that sometimes the most effective tool a lawyer can have is being underestimated by the people you're preparing to destroy. Opponents become careless when they believe they're dealing with someone who doesn't understand their methods or capabilities. They reveal their true intentions and make critical mistakes when they think they're safe from consequences. This principle had served me well throughout my professional life, and it was proving equally valuable in retirement as I observed Rebecca's increasingly bold attempts to position herself for inheritance theft. She had no idea that every conversation, every suggestion about helping with finances, every comment about my supposed confusion was being carefully documented and analyzed by someone who understood exactly what she was attempting to accomplish. So I had become very good at playing the role of the confused elderly widow. When it served my strategic purposes, I would act overwhelmed by technology, ask for help with financial documents I understood better than the people explaining them to me, and let family members believe I was becoming dependent and vulnerable when it suited my need to observe their true character. This performance wasn't just professional habit. It was a deliberate strategy for gathering intelligence about people whose motivations I suspected were less than honorable. Rebecca had been given multiple opportunities to demonstrate genuine care and consideration for my welfare, and she had failed every single test by revealing that her primary interest was in positioning herself to benefit from my eventual death, rather than contributing to my current happiness and well-being. The technology confusion was particularly effective because Rebecca, like many people her age, assumed that anyone over 60 was automatically intimidated by smartphones, computers, and modern conveniences. She would watch me struggle with basic functions on my phone and offer to help in ways that involved her accessing my accounts, contacts, and financial applications that she had no legitimate reason to examine. "Margaret, let me show you how to use that banking app," Rebecca would say whenever she noticed me looking at my phone during family gatherings. It's really quite simple once you understand the basics. But these offers to help invariably involved Rebecca taking my phone and navigating through screens that revealed account balances, transaction histories, and financial information that she was clearly memorizing for future reference. She thought she was cleverly gathering intelligence about my assets while helping a confused elderly woman, when in reality she was demonstrating exactly the kind of predatory behavior that I had spent my career learning to recognize and prosecute. The requests for help with financial documents followed similar patterns. Rebecca would volunteer to assist with paperwork that she claimed looked complicated or overwhelming, but her assistance always involved her examining documents thoroughly and asking questions about asset values, beneficiary designations, and estate planning decisions that went far beyond what would be necessary for simple administrative help. During a family dinner last spring, Rebecca had offered to help me organize some insurance paperwork that I had deliberately left visible on my kitchen counter. As she sorted through the documents, I watched her carefully photographing policy numbers and beneficiary information with her phone while pretending to create a filing system for my benefit. "I think it would be helpful if David and I kept copies of these important documents," Rebecca had suggested. "That way, if something happened to you, we'd be able to handle everything properly." The suggestion that my son and daughter-in-law should maintain copies of my private financial documents in case something happened was exactly the kind of overreach that indicated Rebecca was already planning for my death and positioning herself to take control of assets that she had never contributed to accumulating. But Rebecca's character flaws extended beyond simple greed to include a fundamental lack of respect for elderly people that made her behavior particularly offensive. She had begun to speak to me in the condescending tone that some younger people used with seniors, as if my age automatically meant I was incapable of understanding complex situations or making rational decisions. "Now, Margaret, you don't need to worry about these complicated financial matters," Rebecca would say when I asked questions about investments or estate planning. "David and I can handle all of that for you, so you can just focus on enjoying your retirement." This patronizing attitude revealed that Rebecca viewed me not as an experienced adult who deserved respect and consideration, but as a burden to be managed and eventually eliminated from decision-making processes that affected my own life and legacy. She had begun to treat conversations about my preferences and plans as if they were quaint expressions from someone who didn't understand the practical realities that would determine her future. More troubling, Rebecca had begun to openly discuss her plans for, quote, helping me manage my affairs, in ways that clearly indicated she was positioning herself to gain control over assets and properties that she had never contributed to building or maintaining. These discussions typically occurred when she thought I couldn't hear clearly, or when she assumed I was too distracted to understand the implications of what she was saying. During my son David's birthday celebration 6 months ago, I had overheard Rebecca talking to her sister Lisa about their plans for my house and property once I was no longer able to live independently. The conversation revealed that Rebecca had already decided I would eventually need to move to assisted living, and that she and David would then inherit my property, which they planned to sell to fund their own lifestyle improvements. "The house is worth at least $800,000 in today's market," Rebecca had told her sister. "And that's not even counting Margaret's investment accounts and life insurance policies. David's going to be very well set up once everything gets sorted out." The casual way Rebecca discussed liquidating my assets as if they were already hers revealed exactly how she viewed our relationship and my future. I wasn't a family member who deserved love, respect, and support during my senior years. I was a temporary obstacle preventing her from accessing wealth that she considered rightfully hers through marriage. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of Rebecca's character was her complete lack of curiosity about my professional background, or the source of the assets she was so eager to inherit. She had never asked about my career, my achievements, or the work that had enabled me to accumulate the wealth she was planning to spend. In Rebecca's mind, I was simply an elderly widow who had somehow acquired money and property that would eventually belong to her and David. This lack of interest in my actual life and accomplishments wasn't just personally hurtful, it was also strategically stupid. If Rebecca had bothered to research my background, she would have discovered that attempting to defraud a retired litigation attorney who specialized in inheritance disputes was approximately as intelligent as trying to rob a police station during a shift change. But Rebecca's arrogance and greed had blinded her to the possibility that her elderly target might be someone with the knowledge, resources, and connections needed to destroy anyone who attempted to exploit her. She saw only what she wanted to see, a confused old woman with valuable assets, and no one capable of protecting her from manipulation and theft. This fundamental miscalculation was about to cost Rebecca everything she had worked to position herself to steal. Because the woman she thought she could manipulate and ultimately defraud was actually someone who had built her entire career around ensuring that people exactly like Rebecca faced consequences they would never forget. The birthday celebration at the Riverside Country Club was going to be the stage for Rebecca's complete destruction, though she had no idea that her carefully planned humiliation was about to trigger a legal response that would leave her homeless, bankrupt, and criminally prosecuted for attempted inheritance fraud. But to understand the full magnitude of Rebecca's miscalculation, you need to understand exactly who Margaret Thornfield really was, beneath the grandmother facade that had fooled her so completely, and why her decision to publicly humiliate someone with my background was about to become the most expensive mistake of her worthless, greedy life. To understand how completely Rebecca misjudged the woman she chose to humiliate at that birthday celebration, you need to understand who Margaret Thornfield really was, beneath the gentle grandmother facade that had fooled her so thoroughly. Because the story of how my daughter-in-law ended up facing criminal charges and financial ruin begins with understanding that I wasn't just another elderly widow struggling with modern life. I was someone who had helped shape Illinois family law and estate litigation for over 4 decades, building a reputation that made opposing attorneys tremble and families reconsider their schemes to defraud elderly relatives. My journey into family law began in 1978, when I was 26 years old and one of only 12 women in my graduating class at Northwestern University School of Law. The legal profession was still largely dominated by men who believed that women lacked the intellectual rigor and emotional toughness required for complex litigation, and family law was often dismissed as a, quote, soft specialty that didn't require the same level of strategic thinking as corporate or criminal practice. But I had grown up watching my own grandmother navigate a vicious inheritance dispute that nearly destroyed our family when greedy relatives attempted to steal her property through forged documents and fraudulent legal maneuvers. That experience had taught me that family law wasn't soft at all. It was often the most brutal and emotionally devastating form of litigation because it involved people who were supposed to love and protect each other, but who instead chose greed and manipulation over basic human decency. My grandmother, Eleanor Whitfield, had been a sharp, independent woman who owned a successful millinery business in downtown Chicago during the 1940s and 1950s. When my grandfather died suddenly in 1961, several distant relatives who had never shown interest in our family suddenly appeared with claims that Grandma Eleanor was too emotionally distraught to manage her business and property, and that they should be appointed as conservators to protect her interests. The legal battle that followed lasted 3 years and consumed most of Grandma Eleanor's savings, before she was finally able to prove that the relatives were attempting to steal her assets through fraudulent court filings and false testimony about her mental competence. The experience left her financially devastated and emotionally scarred, but it also taught me that elderly people needed aggressive legal advocates who understood the sophisticated methods that family predators use to steal from vulnerable relatives. Margaret, my grandmother had told me during my senior year of college, promise me that you'll use your education to protect people like me from families who forget that love isn't supposed to be conditional on inheritance prospects. That promise shaped every decision I made throughout law school and my early career. While my classmates were competing for positions at prestigious corporate firms that offered high salaries and social status, I was seeking opportunities to specialize in the complex intersection of family law, estate planning, and inheritance disputes that most attorneys avoided, because the cases were emotionally difficult and often involved clients who couldn't afford to pay premium legal fees. My first position was with Morrison Associates, a small but respected family law firm that handled cases for middle-class families dealing with divorce, custody disputes, and estate administration. The firm's senior partner, James Patterson, was a brilliant attorney who had developed innovative strategies for protecting elderly clients from family exploitation. And he became my mentor in understanding the psychological and legal dynamics that made inheritance fraud such a widespread and devastating problem. Margaret, James had explained during my first week at the firm. Most people think family law is about divorce and child custody, but the real money and the most vicious behavior usually involve elderly family members who have accumulated wealth that younger relatives want to control. These cases require not just legal expertise, but psychological understanding of how greed transforms family relationships into predatory situations. James was right. During my first 2 years at Morrison Associates, I worked on cases involving adult children who had convinced elderly parents to sign over properties temporarily and then refused to return them, grandchildren who isolated elderly relatives from other family members while systematically draining their bank accounts, and supposed caregivers who manipulated confused seniors into changing wills and beneficiary designations in ways that eliminated legitimate heirs. Each case taught me new techniques for investigating family fraud and building legal strategies that could expose and prosecute relatives who preyed on elderly victims. I learned how to analyze financial records for patterns that indicated exploitation, how to document behavioral changes that suggested undue influence, and how to present complex evidence in ways that judges and juries could understand and apply. But perhaps most importantly, I learned that successful prosecution of family fraud required understanding the psychology of both the perpetrators and the victims. Elderly targets were often reluctant to pursue legal action against family members, even when the evidence of theft was overwhelming, because they feared being completely isolated from relatives who might provide some connection and companionship despite their criminal behavior. Perpetrators, on the other hand, typically shared certain characteristics that made them both predictable and ultimately defeatable. They underestimated elderly victims, assuming that age automatically meant confusion and vulnerability. They became overconfident in their schemes, believing that family relationships provided protection from legal consequences. Most importantly, they documented their crimes through communications, financial transactions, and behavioral patterns that could be traced and used as evidence against them. My breakthrough case came in 1982, when I represented Helen Morrison, an 83-year-old widow whose son and daughter-in-law had convinced her to sell her house and move into their basement apartment so they could, quote, take better care of her. Within 6 months, they had gained access to Helen's bank accounts, changed the beneficiaries on her life insurance policies, and begun liquidating her investments to fund their own lifestyle improvements. The case was particularly challenging because Helen's son, Robert, was a respected accountant who had used his professional knowledge to structure the financial theft in ways that appeared legitimate on the surface. He had created false documents showing that Helen had requested the financial changes, and he had systematically isolated her from other family members and friends who might have questioned the sudden modifications to her estate planning. But Robert had made critical mistakes that revealed his true intentions to anyone who understood how to analyze the evidence properly. The timing of the financial changes corresponded exactly with periods when Helen had been hospitalized or sedated from medical procedures, suggesting that she had been unable to make informed decisions about the transactions. The pattern of withdrawals and investments showed that the money was being used for Robert's personal expenses, rather than Helen's care or benefit. Most damning, Robert had been careless with his communications, sending emails and text messages to his wife that explicitly discussed their plans to, quote, maximize the inheritance and, quote, make sure mom doesn't live long enough to spend everything. The investigation took 8 months of intensive work, during which I essentially became an expert in forensic accounting, elder psychology, and the legal requirements for proving undue influence in family relationships. I learned how to trace financial transactions through multiple accounts, how to document patterns of isolation and manipulation, and how to present technical evidence in ways that demonstrated the calculated nature of Robert's theft. The breakthrough came when I discovered that Robert had been using Helen's Social Security number to open credit accounts that were being charged for his personal purchases, while the bills were being sent to Helen's address. This identity theft was a federal crime that provided additional leverage for prosecution and demonstrated that Robert's criminal behavior extended beyond simple family manipulation. When the case finally went to trial, the evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Robert was convicted of elder abuse, financial fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy, resulting in a 7-year prison sentence and an order to pay full restitution to Helen for all stolen assets, plus punitive damages. But more importantly for my career, the Morrison case established my reputation as an attorney who could successfully prosecute complex family fraud cases that other lawyers considered too difficult or emotionally challenging to handle. The legal strategies I developed were adopted by other attorneys, and the case became a landmark precedent for proving undue influence in inheritance disputes. Within 5 years of the Morrison case, I had been recruited to join Thornfield, Morrison Associates, a prestigious firm that specialized in high-stakes family litigation for wealthy clients whose substantial assets made them targets for sophisticated inheritance fraud schemes. The firm's client base included some of the most prominent families in the Midwest, people whose wealth and social status made them attractive targets for relatives, caregivers, and supposed friends who saw elderly family members as opportunities for financial advancement. The move to Thornfield, Morrison & Associates represented a significant advancement in my career, but it also meant taking on cases that were more complex, more emotionally difficult, and often more dangerous than anything I had handled previously. Wealthy families attracted more sophisticated criminals who used advanced methods to steal assets and manipulate elderly victims, and the stakes were high enough to motivate some perpetrators to use intimidation, threats, and occasionally violence to achieve their goals. My first major case at the new firm involved the Westfield family, whose elderly patriarch, Charles Westfield, had accumulated a fortune of over $50 million through successful real estate investments and business ventures. When Charles began showing early signs of dementia at age 78, several family members and supposed friends immediately began positioning themselves to gain control of his assets through various fraudulent schemes. The case involved multiple perpetrators using different methods to steal from Charles simultaneously. His nephew had convinced him to invest in a fraudulent business venture that was designed to funnel money into offshore accounts. His live-in caregiver had been forging his signature on checks and systematically draining his bank accounts. His stepson had manipulated him into changing his will to eliminate other family members and increase his own inheritance. The investigation required coordinating with federal authorities, private investigators, and forensic accountants to trace stolen assets through multiple jurisdictions and complex financial structures. The legal proceedings took over 2 years and involved prosecuting 7 different defendants for various forms of elder abuse, fraud, and conspiracy. But the Westfield case was also personally satisfying because it demonstrated that wealthy elderly victims could receive justice when they had access to the kind of aggressive legal representation that most seniors couldn't afford. By the time the prosecutions were complete, Charles had recovered nearly $40 million in stolen assets, and the perpetrators were facing substantial prison sentences that would serve as deterrents for other potential family predators. The success of the Westfield case led to my promotion to senior partner at Thornfield, Morrison & Associates, and over the next 30 years, I built a practice that was recognized throughout Illinois as the premier destination for families dealing with inheritance fraud, elder abuse, and complex estate disputes. My specialty became cases that other attorneys considered impossible to win, situations where the evidence was complex, the perpetrators were sophisticated, and the emotional dynamics were so complicated that victims were reluctant to pursue legal action against family members, despite clear evidence of criminal behavior. I developed innovative investigative techniques that could uncover evidence of family fraud, even when the perpetrators had used advanced methods to conceal their crimes. I learned how to work with psychological experts to document the mental and emotional manipulation that preceded financial theft. I built relationships with federal investigators who could trace stolen assets through international financial systems. But perhaps most importantly, I developed a reputation for being absolutely ruthless in pursuing maximum consequences for family members who preyed on elderly relatives. I never accepted plea bargains that allowed perpetrators to avoid meaningful punishment, and I consistently sought civil damages that would financially destroy criminals and serve as warnings to others who might consider similar schemes. This approach was emotionally demanding and professionally risky, because it meant taking on cases that required enormous investments of time and resources with no guarantee of success. Many of my clients were elderly victims who had limited financial resources and family support, which meant that I often worked for reduced fees or on contingency arrangements that required me to absorb the costs of complex investigations and lengthy legal proceedings. But the work was also deeply meaningful, because it provided justice for vulnerable victims who had been betrayed by people they trusted. And it created legal precedents that made it more difficult for future predators to exploit elderly family members. Over the course of my career, I handled over 300 major inheritance fraud cases, recovered more than $200 million in stolen assets, and helped to convict over 800 family members and caregivers who had attempted to defraud elderly victims. These statistics represented more than professional success. They represented justice for vulnerable people who had been betrayed by those who were supposed to protect them. But the most important aspect of my work wasn't the money recovered or the criminals convicted. It was the psychological understanding I developed of how family predators operated and what methods were most effective for exposing and prosecuting their crimes. I learned that family fraud typically followed predictable patterns that could be recognized and documented by anyone who understood what to look for. Perpetrators usually began with small violations of trust, borrowing money without permission, using elderly relatives' credit cards for personal purchases, or making minor changes to financial accounts, before escalating to more serious crimes as they gained confidence and access. They also typically used similar psychological manipulation techniques to gain control over elderly victims. They would isolate victims from other family members and friends who might question their behavior. They would create dependency by convincing victims that they were too confused or frail to manage their own affairs. They would use guilt and emotional manipulation to discourage victims from seeking outside help or legal advice. Most importantly, perpetrators almost always underestimated their elderly targets, assuming that age automatically meant vulnerability, and that elderly victims lacked the knowledge, resources, or determination needed to fight back against family exploitation. This pattern of underestimation was exactly what made Rebecca's behavior so predictable and ultimately self-destructive. She had followed the standard playbook for family fraud so precisely that I had been able to anticipate and document her every move, long before she made her fatal mistake at my birthday celebration. Rebecca thought she was manipulating a confused elderly widow who didn't understand modern finance or family dynamics. In reality, she was revealing her criminal intentions to someone who had spent 40 years learning to recognize and prosecute people exactly like her. The birthday party at the Riverside Country Club wasn't just going to be the scene of Rebecca's public humiliation. It was going to be the moment when she discovered that she had chosen to target someone with the knowledge, experience, and resources needed to destroy her completely. But to understand the full scope of the consequences Rebecca was about to face, you need to understand not just my professional expertise, but also the financial resources and legal connections that I had accumulated during my successful career, and why her attempts to steal my inheritance were about to trigger a response that would leave her homeless, bankrupt, and facing serious criminal charges. The woman Rebecca thought she could intimidate and defraud was actually someone who had more money, more legal knowledge, and more powerful connections than she could possibly imagine. And her decision to publicly humiliate me at my own birthday celebration was about to become the most expensive mistake of her greedy, manipulative life. To understand the depth of Rebecca's betrayal and why her humiliation of me at that birthday party was the culmination of years of calculated manipulation rather than a single moment of poor judgment, you need to understand who Rebecca Chen Morrison had become by her 32nd birthday. Not the loving daughter-in-law she pretended to be, but a calculating, narcissistic woman whose greed had grown so complete that she genuinely believed elderly people existed primarily to fund her lifestyle and advance her social status. Rebecca Chen had entered my family's life in September 2019 when she began dating my son David during what he described as a difficult period in his personal and professional development. David, who was 35 at the time, had recently ended a long-term relationship with Sarah Williams, a compassionate pediatric nurse who had treated our family with genuine warmth and respect during their 4 years together. The relationship with Sarah had ended because David felt pressured to make a serious commitment that would require him to prioritize their partnership over his career ambitions in pharmaceutical sales. Sarah had wanted to discuss marriage and children, topics that David found overwhelming and premature, despite being in his mid-30s and earning a substantial income that could easily support a family. "Mom, Sarah is a wonderful person, but she wants things from me that I'm just not ready to provide," David had explained during one of our Sunday dinners. "I need to focus on building my territory and establishing myself professionally before I can think about taking on the responsibilities of marriage and family." The breakup with Sarah had been amicable but emotionally difficult for David, who genuinely cared for her but couldn't overcome his anxiety about commitment and responsibility. For several months after their separation, David had focused entirely on his work, traveling extensively throughout the Midwest to build relationships with medical practices and hospital systems that purchased pharmaceutical supplies. This period of intense professional focus had been productive for David's career, but isolating for his personal life. He was working 60-hour weeks, traveling 4 days out of every week, and spending his limited free time on work-related activities that left little opportunity for developing meaningful relationships or maintaining social connections. When David met Rebecca at a medical conference in downtown Chicago, he was vulnerable to the attention and admiration of someone who seemed impressed by his professional success and understanding of his career demands. Rebecca was working as a pharmaceutical sales representative for a competing company, which meant she understood the industry and could relate to the challenges and opportunities that shaped David's daily life. "She gets it, Mom," David had told me after their third date. "Rebecca understands that my job requires travel and irregular schedules, and she's not threatened by my need to prioritize client relationships and territory development. She's actually excited about my success, instead of seeing it as a problem." This initial compatibility was appealing to David, who had grown frustrated with previous relationships where women had viewed his career demands as obstacles to their personal happiness, rather than important professional responsibilities that deserved support and understanding. But what David interpreted as understanding and support was actually something much more calculating and dangerous. Rebecca hadn't been attracted to David's personality, his character, or his potential as a loving partner. She had been attracted to his financial stability, his family connections, and most importantly, his relationship with me as his only heir and closest family member. Rebecca Chen had grown up in a middle-class family in Naperville, Illinois, where her parents, both accountants, had instilled in her a deep appreciation for financial security and social status that had gradually transformed into an obsession with wealth accumulation and lifestyle advancement that defined all of her major life decisions. During her childhood, Rebecca's family had lived modestly but comfortably, maintaining the kind of financial stability that allowed for annual vacations, private music lessons, and college savings accounts that ensured their children would have educational opportunities. But Rebecca had always been aware that their lifestyle was dependent on careful budgeting, and that luxury items, expensive travel, and social activities were limited by practical financial constraints. This awareness had created in Rebecca a deep resentment of financial limitations and a burning desire to achieve the kind of wealth that would allow her to live without considering costs, budgets, or practical constraints. She didn't want to work for financial security. She wanted to marry into it, inherit it, or manipulate her way into it through relationships that could provide access to wealth she had never earned. During college at DePaul University, where Rebecca studied marketing with a focus on pharmaceutical sales, she had been careful to cultivate relationships with classmates whose families had substantial wealth and social connections. She wasn't interested in academic achievement or professional development for their own sake. She was building a network of relationships that could provide opportunities for advancement and access to people who could improve her financial prospects. Rebecca's approach to dating during college had been similarly strategic. She wasn't looking for emotional connection, intellectual compatibility, or shared values. She was evaluating potential partners based on their family wealth, career prospects, and likelihood of achieving the kind of financial success that could support the lifestyle she wanted to maintain. This transactional approach to relationships had continued throughout Rebecca's 20s, as she moved through a series of boyfriends who were selected primarily for their earning potential and social status, rather than their character or compatibility. Each relationship was an opportunity to gain access to social circles, professional networks, and lifestyle experiences that she couldn't afford independently. But Rebecca's dating strategy had been only partially successful because most wealthy men eventually recognized her mercenary motivations and ended relationships when they realized she was more interested in their bank accounts than their personalities. By her late 20s, Rebecca had developed a reputation among certain social circles as someone who dated strategically rather than authentically, which made it more difficult for her to attract the kind of high-value targets she preferred. When Rebecca met David at that medical conference, she immediately recognized him as an ideal opportunity to achieve her long-term financial goals. David was successful enough to support a comfortable lifestyle, but not so wealthy that he would be suspicious of women who were interested in his money. More importantly, David was clearly close to his mother, and had mentioned during their initial conversations that he was likely to inherit substantial assets from family members who had been financially successful. Rebecca's initial research into David's background had revealed that his mother was a widow living in an expensive area of Chicago, apparently without significant family obligations or financial dependence other than David himself. This suggested that David's eventual inheritance could be substantial, and that building a relationship with him could provide long-term access to wealth that Rebecca could never accumulate through her own career efforts. But Rebecca's most important discovery was that David seemed somewhat naive about women who might be interested in his money rather than his personality. His previous relationship with Sarah had been based on genuine emotional connection and shared values, which suggested that David wasn't experienced in recognizing the warning signs of mercenary behavior in romantic partners. This naivete made David an ideal target for someone with Rebecca's skills in manipulation and emotional performance. She could present herself as someone who was genuinely attracted to his success and impressed by his achievements, while gradually positioning herself to gain access to his family relationships and financial information. Rebecca's strategy for winning David's affection was sophisticated and carefully calculated. She presented herself as someone who was impressed by his professional accomplishments, but not dependent on his financial support. She had her own career and income, which meant she could appear independent while gradually becoming more involved in his personal and family life. During their early dating period, Rebecca was careful to demonstrate enthusiasm for David's work and admiration for his achievements in ways that made him feel appreciated and understood. She would ask detailed questions about his sales strategies, celebrate his professional victories, and express genuine interest in the pharmaceutical industry that made her seem like an ideal partner for someone whose career was central to his identity. But Rebecca's performance of interest and admiration was always strategic rather than genuine. She wasn't actually fascinated by pharmaceutical sales or impressed by David's professional skills. She was gathering information about his income, his career prospects, and his family relationships that could be useful for her long-term planning. The questions Rebecca asked about David's work were designed to elicit information about his earnings, his territory value, and his potential for advancement within his company. The enthusiasm she showed for his achievements was calculated to make him feel special and appreciated in ways that would encourage him to share more personal and financial information. Most importantly, Rebecca was careful to express interest in meeting David's family and learning about his background in ways that seemed natural and affectionate rather than calculating and intrusive. She would mention how important family relationships were to her, how much she valued the wisdom of older generations, and how excited she was to meet the people who had shaped David into the man she claimed to love. This family-focused approach was particularly effective with David, who had a close relationship with me and wanted any serious partner to appreciate and respect the family connections that were important to him. Rebecca's apparent eagerness to build relationships with his family members seemed like evidence that she was genuinely interested in a long-term commitment rather than a casual relationship. When Rebecca finally met me during Thanksgiving dinner in 2019, she had already spent 2 months researching my background and developing a strategy for making a positive impression while gathering intelligence about my assets and estate planning. She had discovered through online research that I lived in an expensive neighborhood, had worked in a prestigious profession, and appeared to have substantial financial resources that would eventually be inherited by David. But Rebecca had also discovered that I lived alone, had no other children or close family members, and appeared to be someone who might be vulnerable to the kind of gradual manipulation and isolation that preceded family financial exploitation. This combination of wealth and apparent vulnerability made me an ideal target for someone with Rebecca's predatory instincts and sophisticated understanding of how to exploit elderly family members. Rebecca's performance during that first Thanksgiving dinner was masterful in its calculation and deception. She presented herself as someone who was grateful for the opportunity to meet David's family, respectful of my experience and wisdom, and genuinely interested in building a meaningful relationship with me as David's mother. Mrs. Thornfield, David has told me so much about you, and I'm just honored to finally meet the woman who raised such an incredible man, Rebecca had said during our introduction, with exactly the right combination of respect and warmth to make a positive first impression. Throughout the evening, Rebecca was careful to ask questions about my background and interests that seemed natural and caring rather than intrusive and calculating. She expressed admiration for my career accomplishments, interest in my hobbies and activities, and appreciation for the beautiful home where David had grown up. But I had noticed immediately that Rebecca's questions were more focused on my living situation, my daily routines, and my financial management than on my personal interests or emotional well-being. She wanted to know whether I had help with household maintenance, whether I found it difficult to manage my finances independently, and whether I had concerns about my ability to continue living alone as I grew older. These questions were exactly the kind of probing that I had learned to recognize as potential indicators of someone who was evaluating an elderly person's vulnerability to manipulation and exploitation. Genuine concern for my welfare would have focused on my happiness, my health, and my social connections, rather than my practical limitations and potential dependencies. Rebecca had also been unusually interested in the details of my home, asking questions about when I had purchased it, whether I had considered downsizing, and what my long-term plans were for the property. Again, these questions seemed caring on the surface, but were actually designed to gather information about my assets and estate planning that could be useful for future manipulation. But perhaps most revealing was Rebecca's reaction to the family photographs and personal mementos throughout my home. While genuine family interest would have focused on the stories and memories represented by these items, Rebecca's attention was clearly focused on evidence of wealth, travel, and lifestyle expenses that indicated the scope of assets she might eventually access through her relationship with David. During the months that followed that first meeting, Rebecca had systematically cultivated our relationship in ways that were designed to position her as a caring, devoted family member while gathering intelligence about my finances and gradually establishing herself as someone who should be involved in important family decisions. She would call regularly to check on my well-being, visit frequently to help with household tasks, and volunteer to assist with errands and appointments in ways that seemed thoughtful and generous. But these gestures of care were always accompanied by subtle probing about my financial situation, my estate planning, and my concerns about aging independently. Rebecca had also begun to plant seeds of doubt about my ability to continue living alone safely, suggesting that my house was too large for one person, that my neighborhood was becoming less safe, and that I might benefit from having family members more involved in my daily care and financial management. David and I worry about you living alone in this big house, Rebecca would say during her visits. What if something happened and no one was here to help? Maybe we should start thinking about some arrangements that would give us all peace of mind. These expressions of concern seemed loving and appropriate on the surface, but they were actually part of a calculated strategy to convince me that I was becoming dependent and vulnerable in ways that required family intervention and oversight. The most insidious aspect of Rebecca's manipulation was her gradual campaign to position herself as the primary family member responsible for my care and well-being. She would volunteer to handle medical appointments, offer to help with financial paperwork, and suggest that she should be added to my emergency contacts and medical decision-making authority. Each of these suggestions seemed reasonable and caring when presented individually, but together they represented a systematic effort to gain legal and practical control over my life and assets. Rebecca was building a foundation for the kind of comprehensive family exploitation that I had spent my career learning to recognize and prosecute. But Rebecca's most serious miscalculation was her assumption that I was actually vulnerable to the kind of manipulation she was attempting. She had based her strategy on the belief that I was a confused elderly widow who didn't understand modern financial systems and who would be grateful for family help with complex decisions and practical matters. In reality, Rebecca was revealing her predatory intentions to someone who had spent 40 years learning to recognize and defeat people exactly like her. Every concerned question, every offer of help, and every suggestion about my need for family oversight was being carefully documented and analyzed by someone who understood exactly what she was attempting to accomplish. The birthday party at the Riverside Country Club was going to be Rebecca's moment of complete overconfidence, when she would reveal her true character so completely that I would have all the evidence needed to destroy her legally, financially, and socially. But to understand why Rebecca's gift of a broom would trigger such devastating consequences, you need to understand the full scope of my hidden resources and capabilities, and why her attempt to publicly humiliate someone with my background was about to become the most expensive mistake of her manipulative, greedy life. To understand the full magnitude of Rebecca's miscalculation when she decided to humiliate me at that birthday party, you need to understand the complete scope of resources, connections, and capabilities that the woman she saw as a vulnerable elderly widow had accumulated during 42 years of legal practice. Because while Rebecca thought she was targeting a confused old woman who lived alone and struggled with modern life, the reality was that she had just declared war on someone whose wealth, professional network, and legal expertise were so far beyond her comprehension that her public humiliation of me would trigger consequences she never could have imagined possible. The woman Rebecca left holding that dirty broom at the Riverside Country Club wasn't just a retired attorney. She was someone who had built one of the most successful family law practices in Illinois, accumulated substantial personal wealth, and maintained relationships with judges, prosecutors, and investigators who could mobilize resources that would make her complete destruction both swift and devastating. Let me paint you a picture of the actual resources that Rebecca never bothered to discover, because understanding my true capabilities is essential to comprehending how spectacularly she had misjudged her situation, and why her birthday humiliation was about to result in her complete and permanent downfall. During my 42-year career at Thornfield, Morrison Associates, I hadn't just been a well-compensated attorney, I had been one of the highest-earning family law specialists in the Midwest, with annual compensation that often exceeded $500,000 when complex cases and contingency fees were included. My expertise in inheritance fraud and elder abuse litigation had made me one of the most sought-after attorneys in Illinois, with clients who were willing to pay premium fees for representation that could protect substantial family assets from sophisticated predators. But my professional income was only the foundation of a much larger financial empire that I had built through careful investing, strategic real estate acquisition, and business partnerships that had multiplied my wealth far beyond what most people could accumulate through salary alone. My understanding of legal systems, financial structures, and investment strategies had given me insights into wealth-building opportunities that weren't available to people without my specialized knowledge and professional connections. My primary residence in Lincoln Park, where Rebecca had visited numerous times while pretending to be a caring daughter-in-law, was worth approximately $2.8 million according to current market assessments. But the house itself was only one component of a real estate portfolio that included rental properties in Chicago, vacation homes in Wisconsin and Florida, and commercial real estate investments that generated substantial passive income. The rental properties alone generated over $30,000 monthly in net income, providing financial independence that meant I could pursue legal cases based on their merit rather than their potential profitability. This financial freedom had allowed me to take on cases involving elderly victims who couldn't afford premium legal fees, while also maintaining the lifestyle and resources necessary to conduct sophisticated investigations and lengthy prosecutions. My investment portfolio, managed by Morgan Stanley's Private Wealth Division, was worth approximately $12 million and included diversified holdings in stocks, bonds, mutual funds, and alternative investments that had been carefully selected to provide both growth and stability. The portfolio was designed to support my current lifestyle indefinitely, while preserving wealth that could be passed to future generations or donated to charitable causes that aligned with my values. But perhaps most importantly, my financial resources included substantial liquid assets that could be mobilized quickly for legal action, private investigations, or any other purposes that might be necessary to protect my interests or pursue justice against people who had wronged me. I maintained checking and savings accounts with combined balances of over $800,000, providing the kind of immediate financial flexibility that most people could never access, even in emergency situations. This financial foundation was supplemented by business interests that had been developed through strategic partnerships with other legal professionals, real estate developers, and investment groups that had recognized my expertise and wanted to include me in ventures that required sophisticated understanding of legal and regulatory environments. My partnership in Lakefront Development Corporation, a real estate investment company that specialized in luxury residential properties, had been generating annual returns of over $200,000 for the past decade. My involvement in the Chicago Legal Investment Fund, which provided capital for attorneys pursuing complex contingency cases, had produced similar returns while also supporting the kind of justice-focused litigation that had been central to my career. These business relationships weren't just sources of additional income. They were also professional networks that could provide resources, expertise, and support for complex legal actions that required coordination between multiple specialists and substantial financial investment. But beyond my personal wealth, I had access to professional resources that were far more powerful than money alone. During my 42 years of practice, I had built relationships with judges, prosecutors, investigators, and legal specialists who respected my expertise and valued my contributions to the legal community in ways that provided access to resources and capabilities that most people could never obtain. My relationship with federal judge Patricia Williams, who had presided over several of my most important inheritance fraud cases, was based on mutual respect and shared commitment to protecting elderly victims from family exploitation. Judge Williams had frequently commented on the quality of my legal work and the importance of my contributions to developing legal precedents that made it easier to prosecute family predators. When I needed expert witnesses, investigative resources, or expedited court proceedings, Judge Williams and other members of the federal judiciary were willing to provide assistance that reflected their understanding of my professional reputation and their confidence in my ability to build compelling cases that served the interests of justice. My connections within the FBI's Financial Crimes Division were similarly valuable because agents who had worked with me during complex investigations understood that my cases were always thoroughly researched, legally sound, and focused on genuine crimes rather than frivolous complaints. When I contacted Agent Sarah Martinez about suspicious financial activity or potential elder abuse, she knew that my concerns were based on professional analysis rather than family disputes or personal grievances. These relationships meant that Rebecca's criminal activity would receive attention and resources that were typically unavailable for elder abuse cases involving defendants without substantial financial resources or professional connections. Federal prosecutors who respected my work and understood the importance of deterring family exploitation would ensure that Rebecca's case received the kind of aggressive prosecution that would send a clear message about the consequences of targeting elderly family members. But perhaps most importantly, my professional network included private investigators, forensic accountants, and cybersecurity specialists who could conduct comprehensive investigations that would expose every aspect of Rebecca's fraudulent behavior and provide evidence that would be both legally admissible and personally devastating. Marcus Chen, a former FBI agent who had established a private investigation firm specializing in financial crimes, had worked with me on over 50 cases involving family fraud and elder abuse. Marcus had access to databases, surveillance capabilities, and investigative techniques that could build comprehensive profiles of suspected criminals and document their activities in ways that would support both criminal prosecution and civil litigation. When I needed someone investigated, Marcus could provide detailed reports on their financial history, employment record, criminal background, and personal relationships that would reveal patterns of behavior and potential vulnerabilities that could be exploited during legal proceedings. Rebecca's investigation had been ongoing for over 18 months, during which Marcus had documented her financial situation, her dating history, her family relationships, and her professional conduct, in ways that revealed a consistent pattern of manipulative behavior and strategic relationship building that supported criminal charges for attempted inheritance fraud. The investigation had revealed that Rebecca's apparent financial independence was largely illusory, built on credit card debt, student loans, and personal loans that consumed nearly 80% of her income. Her lifestyle was unsustainable without additional income sources, which explained her intense focus on gaining access to David's family wealth and her systematic efforts to position herself for inheritance theft. Marcus had also discovered that Rebecca had attempted similar schemes with previous boyfriends, including documented efforts to gain access to family financial information, and suggestions that elderly relatives needed help managing their affairs. These patterns established Rebecca's behavior as systematic rather than opportunistic, which would support enhanced criminal penalties and civil damages that would reflect the calculated nature of her crimes. The financial analysis had also revealed that Rebecca had been using David's credit cards and financial accounts for personal purchases without his knowledge or consent, which constituted fraud that could be prosecuted independently of her attempts to manipulate my estate planning. But the most damaging evidence was Rebecca's communications with her sister Lisa, which had been obtained through legal surveillance methods and revealed explicit discussions of her plans to, quote, maximize the inheritance and ensure that I didn't live long enough to spend everything that she considered rightfully hers through marriage. These communications provided clear evidence of Rebecca's criminal intent and her specific plans to exploit me financially, which would support serious criminal charges and substantial civil penalties that would destroy her financially and ensure that she faced meaningful consequences for her predatory behavior. My legal resources also included relationships with specialists in estate planning, tax law, and asset protection, who could ensure that my wealth was structured in ways that would be immune from any attempts at legal challenge or fraudulent manipulation. Attorney Daniel Park, who had served as my estate planning counsel for over 20 years, had helped me create a comprehensive asset protection strategy that included multiple trusts, offshore accounts, and legal structures that would make it impossible for anyone to gain unauthorized access to my wealth or challenge my estate planning decisions. The estate planning included specific provisions that would automatically disinherit anyone who attempted to challenge my will, manipulate my financial decisions, or engage in any form of elder abuse or exploitation. These provisions were legally enforceable and would ensure that Rebecca's attempts to steal my inheritance would result in her receiving nothing, while also triggering legal action that would hold her accountable for her criminal behavior. But perhaps most importantly, my resources included psychological and emotional support systems that would allow me to pursue aggressive legal action against Rebecca without the family pressure or emotional manipulation that often prevented elderly victims from holding predatory relatives accountable for their crimes. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a forensic psychologist who specialized in elder abuse cases, had been documenting Rebecca's manipulation tactics and their psychological impact on family relationships. Dr. Walsh's analysis would provide expert testimony about the calculated nature of Rebecca's behavior and the systematic way she had attempted to isolate me from other family members while positioning herself to gain control over my assets. This psychological expertise would be crucial for criminal prosecution because it would demonstrate that Rebecca's actions weren't simply family disputes or misunderstandings, but rather sophisticated manipulation designed to facilitate theft from an elderly family member. The combination of financial resources, professional connections, and expert support meant that Rebecca's prosecution would be comprehensive, thorough, and devastating in ways that would serve as a warning to anyone else who might consider exploiting elderly family members. But beyond the legal and financial resources, I had something even more powerful: the knowledge and experience to use these resources strategically and effectively. My 42 years of legal practice had taught me exactly how to build cases that would maximize consequences for defendants while minimizing risks for victims. I knew how to coordinate criminal and civil proceedings to ensure that Rebecca would face both imprisonment and financial ruin. I understood how to present evidence in ways that would maximize media attention and public condemnation that would destroy her reputation and social standing. I had experience in using legal procedures to expose defendants' criminal behavior to their employers, professional associations, and personal networks in ways that would eliminate their ability to continue their predatory activities. Most importantly, I had learned that the most effective justice often came not from single legal victories, but from comprehensive campaigns that addressed every aspect of a defendant's criminal behavior and ensured that they faced consequences that would deter future crimes while providing satisfaction for their victims. Rebecca's prosecution would include federal charges for attempted inheritance fraud, state charges for elder abuse and financial exploitation, civil litigation for damages and restitution, professional misconduct complaints that would affect her career, and social consequences that would destroy her reputation and relationships. But the prosecution would also include strategic elements designed to ensure that Rebecca understood exactly what she had lost by choosing to target someone with my background and resources. The legal campaign would be designed not just to punish her crimes, but to demonstrate the complete futility of attempting to exploit elderly family members who had the knowledge and capability to fight back. The birthday party at the Riverside Country Club had been Rebecca's moment of maximum overconfidence, when she believed she could publicly humiliate me with complete impunity because I was too old, too confused, and too isolated to pose any threat to her plans. But what Rebecca didn't understand was that her public humiliation had just provided me with the perfect opportunity to demonstrate what happened when someone with her character flaws chose to target someone with my background, resources, and determination to ensure that family predators faced consequences they would never forget. The dirty broom she had presented as my birthday gift was about to become the evidence that would destroy her life, because the woman she thought she could intimidate and manipulate was actually someone who had more money, more legal expertise, and more powerful connections than she could possibly comprehend. Rebecca's choice to humiliate me publicly was about to become the most expensive mistake of her greedy, manipulative life. To understand the devastating depth of Rebecca's betrayal when she handed me that dirty broom at my 70th birthday celebration, you need to understand the 35 years of unwavering love, sacrifice, and devotion that I had invested in building David's life. The history that should have made her cruelty impossible rather than inevitable. Because what made Rebecca's humiliation so much more than a single act of selfishness was her complete disregard for everything I had done to create the opportunities, security, and foundation that had made both David's success and her comfortable lifestyle possible in the first place. The story of my relationship with David began in March 1988, when I was 36 years old, and already a rising partner at Thornfield, Morrison Associates, working on cases that were defining the future of family law and inheritance protection. I had been focused entirely on building a career that would make a meaningful difference in protecting vulnerable people from family exploitation, and motherhood had not been part of my immediate plans. But when David Michael Thornfield took his first breath at 4:23 a.m. on March 22, 1988, everything changed. In that moment, holding my son for the first time in the delivery room at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, I made a promise to myself that would shape every decision I made for the next 3.5 decades. David would have every opportunity, every advantage, and every form of support that I could possibly provide, regardless of what sacrifices that commitment might require from me personally or professionally. This wasn't just the usual maternal love that most mothers feel for their children. This was a deliberate, calculated decision to prioritize David's welfare above my own needs, desires, and career ambitions in ways that would prove both transformative and, ultimately, heartbreaking. When Rebecca entered our lives and treated my sacrifices as obstacles to her personal enrichment. David's father, Michael Thornfield, had been a fellow attorney who worked for a prominent corporate law firm in downtown Chicago. Our relationship had been built on professional respect and shared intellectual interests, but Michael's response to my pregnancy revealed exactly who he was beneath his charming professional exterior. Rather than embracing the opportunity to build a family together, Michael immediately began calculating how fatherhood would interfere with his partnership track and the lifestyle he had planned for himself as a successful corporate attorney. "Margaret, I'm just not prepared for this kind of responsibility right now," Michael had told me during the conversation that would end our relationship forever. "I'm 2 years away from making partner, and I can't afford to have family obligations that might distract me from the billable hour requirements and client development that are essential for my career advancement." Michael's suggestion that I should consider ending the pregnancy or placing the baby for adoption so that his partnership timeline wouldn't be disrupted revealed everything I needed to know about his character and priorities. He was willing to abandon his own child rather than accept responsibility for the consequences of our relationship. When I made it clear that I intended to have the baby and raise him myself, Michael's response was to transfer to his firm's London office, providing financial support only when legally required and never maintaining any meaningful relationship with David throughout his childhood and adolescence. This abandonment was emotionally devastating, but it was also clarifying in terms of what I needed to do to ensure David's future. I would be raising him as a single mother, which meant that every decision about my career, my finances, and my personal life would need to be filtered through the question of what would be best for my son's development and opportunities. The first major decision was whether to continue my demanding career at Thornfield, Morrison Associates, or to seek more predictable, family-friendly employment that would provide better work-life balance, but fewer opportunities for professional advancement and financial growth. Many single mothers in my situation would have chosen stability over ambition, prioritizing immediate needs over long-term potential. But I chose differently. I decided that the best thing I could do for David was to excel in my legal career, building the kind of expertise and professional reputation that would provide us with financial security and create opportunities that wouldn't be available if I settled for safer, more conventional choices. This decision required enormous personal sacrifices that David never knew about, because I was determined that he should never feel responsible for limiting my opportunities or creating burdens that might affect his own development. But the reality of combining single motherhood with a demanding legal career meant that almost every aspect of my personal life was subordinated to the dual demands of professional excellence and parental responsibility. During David's infancy and early childhood, I worked cases that required extensive research, long hours of document review, and intensive preparation for complex trials that couldn't be completed quickly or easily. But I also needed to provide David with consistent care, emotional support, and the kind of stable home environment that would allow him to thrive, despite the challenges of being raised by a single parent. The solution was to create elaborate support systems that allowed me to excel professionally while ensuring that David's needs were always met, even when my work required me to be away from home or focused on cases that demanded my complete attention. I hired Mrs. Carmen Rodriguez as David's primary caregiver when he was 4 months old, and she remained part of our family until David started kindergarten. Carmen was a former elementary school teacher who had decided to focus on private childcare so she could provide more individualized attention to the children in her care. Carmen understood that David's situation required more than basic childcare services. She needed to create an environment where he could develop socially and intellectually while I was working cases that sometimes required me to stay late at the office or travel for depositions and court appearances. The cost of this level of professional childcare was substantial, nearly 60% of my attorney's salary during David's first 5 years, but I considered it an essential investment in his development and my ability to continue building the career that would ultimately provide us with long-term financial security and social stability. But the financial cost was manageable compared to the emotional cost of missing so many important moments in David's early development. I missed his first steps because I was in a deposition for a complex inheritance fraud case. I missed his first words because I was preparing for a trial that required weekend work. I missed dozens of bedtime stories, morning routines, and everyday interactions that most parents take for granted. Each missed moment was a reminder of the sacrifices required to provide David with opportunities that wouldn't be available if I had chosen easier paths with lower potential rewards. I was building something larger than immediate comfort or convenience. I was creating a foundation that would allow David to have choices and advantages that most children never received. When David started kindergarten at Francis Parker School, one of Chicago's most prestigious private institutions, new challenges emerged that required different kinds of sacrifices and creative solutions. I needed to be available for parent-teacher conferences, school events, and the various activities that were part of David's educational and social development. But I also needed to continue excelling in my legal career, which often required unpredictable schedules that didn't align with school calendars and family obligations. The tuition at Francis Parker was $28,000 annually, a substantial expense that required careful budgeting and additional income from consulting work and weekend legal research. But I believed that David's education was the most important investment I could make in his future, and I was willing to work extra hours and live more modestly to ensure that he received the best possible academic foundation. During David's elementary and middle school years, I attended every school play, science fair, and athletic event that he wanted me to attend, regardless of professional obligations that might have provided legitimate excuses for absence. When David had a speaking part in his 4th grade presentation about the solar system, I rearranged a client meeting to ensure I could be in the auditorium. When he played in the school basketball league, I attended every game and tournament that didn't conflict with court appearances. But perhaps the most important sacrifice I made during David's childhood was the decision to remain single throughout his formative years. I had several opportunities to develop serious relationships with men who were kind, successful, and genuinely interested in building a life with me and David. The most significant of these relationships was with Judge Robert Manning, whom I met while working on a complex inheritance dispute that required extensive court proceedings. Robert was intelligent, caring, and wonderful with David, who was 9 years old when Robert and I began dating. For 3 years, Robert was a regular presence in our lives, joining us for family dinners, helping David with school projects, and providing the kind of positive male role model that I knew David needed but couldn't provide myself. Robert was also supportive of my career in ways that were rare among men of his generation. He understood the demands of legal practice, respected my expertise, and never suggested that I should compromise my professional ambitions for the sake of our relationship. When Robert proposed marriage during David's 7th grade year, it seemed like the perfect opportunity to create the stable, two-parent family that I had always wanted David to experience. Robert loved David genuinely, and David had grown attached to Robert in ways that suggested he would welcome having a stepfather who could provide additional support and guidance. But I ultimately decided that accepting Robert's proposal would require changes in our family dynamic that might interfere with the close relationship David and I had built during his first 12 years. I was concerned that introducing a stepfather, even one as wonderful as Robert, might dilute the intensity of attention and support that I had been providing David throughout his childhood. The decision to end my relationship with Robert was one of the most difficult choices I ever made, both because I genuinely loved him and because I knew that remaining single meant accepting loneliness and isolation that would continue throughout David's adolescence and young adulthood. But I believed then, and I still believe now, that David's emotional and psychological development was more important than my personal happiness or romantic fulfillment. I wanted him to feel absolutely secure in my love and commitment, without any concern that he might have to compete for my attention, or wonder whether my priorities might shift if I developed serious relationships with other people. This decision meant that all of my emotional energy and personal time was focused on David's development and our relationship, creating a level of intensity and closeness that was both beneficial and, perhaps, ultimately problematic for his character development. Because while my complete focus on David's needs ensured that he felt loved and supported, it also meant that he never learned to consider other people's needs or to appreciate the sacrifices that were being made for his benefit. In my effort to protect David from any sense of burden or responsibility, I may have inadvertently taught him that other people's needs were less important than his own comfort and convenience. During David's high school years at Latin School of Chicago, I continued making major life decisions based primarily on what would be best for his development and opportunities. When I was offered a partnership position with a prestigious New York firm that would have significantly advanced my career, I declined because David was thriving in his Chicago school and had developed friendships and activities that I didn't want to disrupt. When I was invited to join a federal task force on inheritance fraud that would have required extensive travel and provided national recognition for my expertise, I negotiated a modified assignment that would allow me to remain based in Chicago and maintain more predictable schedules that wouldn't interfere with David's activities and needs. These professional decisions cost me opportunities and advancement that would have been beneficial for my long-term career development, but they ensured that David's high school experience was stable and supportive in ways that allowed him to excel academically and develop the confidence that would serve him well in college and beyond. I also made substantial financial investments in David's education and extracurricular activities that required careful budgeting and significant sacrifices in my own lifestyle and preferences. When David expressed interest in studying abroad during his junior year, I paid for a semester at Oxford University that cost $45,000, money that came from my personal savings rather than from funds that had been designated for my own retirement planning. When David wanted to participate in a summer internship program at a prestigious investment firm that was unpaid, but would provide valuable experience and networking opportunities, I covered his living expenses in New York for 3 months, ensuring that he could take advantage of the opportunity without financial stress. When David needed a reliable car during his senior year, not because public transportation wasn't available, but because having his own vehicle would provide independence and social advantages that were important to his teenage development, I purchased a new Honda Accord that cost $32,000, money that came from my investment accounts rather than from current income. Each of these financial decisions required me to live more modestly than my income would have allowed if I had been focused primarily on my own comfort and preferences. While my legal colleagues were buying luxury cars and expensive vacation homes, I was driving older vehicles and living in the same modest house, because every discretionary dollar was being invested in David's present and future needs. The college selection and financing process represented the culmination of 18 years of planning and sacrifice, designed to ensure that David would have educational opportunities that would set him up for lifelong success. I had been saving money for his college education since he was born, building a fund that would allow him to attend whatever university he chose without accumulating the student loan debt that burdened so many of his peers. But beyond the financial preparation, I had also been helping David develop the academic credentials, extracurricular achievements, and personal qualities that would make him competitive for admission to elite universities. This meant supporting his interests, facilitating his activities, and providing the kind of comprehensive guidance that would maximize his potential for academic and personal success. When David was accepted to Northwestern University with partial scholarships that would cover about 40% of his costs, I was proud of his achievements and grateful that the financial planning I had done would make it possible for him to graduate without debt. The remaining college costs, approximately $45,000 per year for 4 years, represented a substantial financial commitment that required me to continue working additional consulting assignments and living modestly to generate the income needed to support his education without compromising my own retirement security. But I made these sacrifices gladly because I believed that David's education was the most important investment I could make in his future and in the relationship we would have once he became an independent adult who understood and appreciated everything I had done to create his opportunities. During David's college years, our relationship continued to be close and affectionate in ways that suggested my sacrifices had been worthwhile. He called regularly to share his experiences, asked for advice about academic and personal decisions, and expressed gratitude for the support I was providing that allowed him to focus on his studies without financial stress. When David graduated with a degree in business administration and immediately found a good position with a pharmaceutical sales company, I felt vindicated in all the choices I had made to prioritize his development over my own immediate needs and preferences. David seemed to have developed into exactly the kind of person I had hoped he would become: intelligent, capable, professionally successful, and grateful for the opportunities that had been provided to him. His early career success suggested that the investments I had made in his education and development would pay dividends in the form of a lifelong relationship built on mutual respect and appreciation. But somewhere during David's late 20s, when he met and began dating Rebecca, subtle changes began to appear in his attitude and behavior that initially concerned me, but that I tried to dismiss as normal aspects of young adult development and the influence of a romantic partner who might have different values and priorities. David's expressions of gratitude became less frequent and less specific, transitioning from detailed appreciation for particular forms of support to generic acknowledgments that seemed more like social obligations than genuine recognition of ongoing assistance. His requests for advice became less common, not because he needed less guidance, but because Rebecca had begun to position herself as his primary source of counsel on personal and financial matters, gradually excluding me from decisions that had previously been shared family discussions. Most troubling, David began to express mild irritation when I offered help or support that Rebecca hadn't approved, as if my continued involvement in his life was becoming an inconvenience, rather than a welcome expression of love and interest. These changes were gradual and subtle enough that I initially attributed them to normal development of independence and the natural influence of a serious romantic relationship. I didn't want to be an overly involved mother who interfered with David's growth into full adulthood and his ability to build a successful partnership with Rebecca. But over time, it became clear that Rebecca's influence on David was fundamentally changing his understanding of family relationships and his appreciation for the sacrifices that had made his success possible. She had convinced him that my involvement in his life was excessive, and that healthy adult relationships required complete independence from family support and guidance. This gradual transformation from grateful son to someone who took my sacrifices for granted was heartbreaking to witness, particularly because it seemed to represent a complete rejection of the values I had tried to instill throughout his childhood and education. The sacrifices I had made to ensure David's success had been motivated by love and the hope that providing him with opportunities would enable him to become someone who understood the importance of generosity, compassion, and mutual support in relationships. Instead, those same sacrifices seem to have taught David that other people's needs were less important than his own comfort, and that the advantages he had received were simply the natural order of things, rather than the result of specific choices and ongoing support that deserved acknowledgement and reciprocation. But the most painful aspect of watching Rebecca's influence transform my relationship with David was recognizing that she was deliberately poisoning his perception of my character and motivations in ways that would make him more susceptible to her manipulation and more willing to participate in her schemes to exploit my assets and estate. Rebecca had convinced David that my occasional requests for assistance were signs of increasing dependency that required family intervention rather than normal family interactions that provided opportunities for mutual support and connection. She had reframed my expressions of concern about his welfare as intrusive behavior that demonstrated my inability to respect his adult independence. Most insidiously, Rebecca had begun to plant suggestions that my advanced age meant I was becoming confused about financial matters, and that responsible family members should begin taking more active roles in protecting my assets from poor decisions or potential exploitation by outsiders. These manipulations were exactly the kind of psychological groundwork that preceded serious inheritance fraud, and I recognized them immediately, because I had seen identical patterns in hundreds of cases involving families who had exploited elderly relatives. Rebecca was systematically isolating me from David's affection and loyalty while positioning herself to gain control over my estate planning and financial decisions. The birthday party at the Riverside Country Club was going to be Rebecca's moment of complete overconfidence, when she would reveal her true character so completely that even David would be forced to recognize that he had been manipulated by someone who viewed our entire family as a source of unearned wealth, rather than people who deserved love and respect. But what Rebecca didn't understand was that her public humiliation of me wasn't just a personal insult. It was also a fundamental rejection of 35 years of love and sacrifice that would trigger consequences more severe than she could possibly comprehend. The woman she handed that dirty broom wasn't just David's mother. She was someone who had given up romantic relationships, career opportunities, and personal preferences to ensure his success, and who now had the resources, expertise, and motivation needed to make sure Rebecca understood exactly what she had lost through her greed and cruelty. Rebecca thought she was humiliating someone who would probably accept the insult and continue providing financial support, because that's what mothers were supposed to do. What she actually did was provide someone who had spent 35 years loving David unconditionally, with definitive proof that his wife was incapable of appreciating that love or deserving the continued sacrifices it had required. And I was going to make sure that when Rebecca finally realized what she had thrown away, she would spend the rest of her life regretting choosing her greed over the love of the person who had made her comfortable lifestyle possible. To understand how Rebecca's public humiliation at my birthday party became the catalyst for her complete destruction, you need to understand the complex web of family dynamics, social expectations, and psychological manipulation that had been developing over the 3 years since she entered our lives. Because what made that moment at the Riverside Country Club so devastating wasn't just the insult itself, but the way it exposed the carefully constructed power structure that Rebecca had built to isolate me from David's affection while positioning herself as the decision-maker in our family relationships. The power dynamic that Rebecca had established was sophisticated and multifaceted, designed to make me appear increasingly dependent and confused, while presenting herself as the capable, modern woman who could protect David from the burdens of caring for an aging mother. This wasn't accidental. It was a calculated strategy that followed the classic patterns of family exploitation that I had spent my career learning to recognize and prosecute. But Rebecca's strategy was particularly insidious because it operated on multiple levels simultaneously, using social expectations about aging, gender roles, and family responsibilities to create a narrative where my legitimate needs for occasional assistance became evidence of declining competence, and her offers of help became proof of her indispensable value to our family's functioning. The foundation of Rebecca's power strategy was her systematic campaign to redefine normal family interactions as signs of my increasing dependency and David's excessive burden in caring for an elderly mother. Every request I made for assistance, whether it was help with technology, transportation to medical appointments, or companionship during difficult experiences, was reframed by Rebecca as evidence that I was becoming unable to live independently, and that David was sacrificing his own needs to accommodate my limitations. "David, you can't keep dropping everything every time your mother needs something," Rebecca would say whenever I asked for help with tasks that required minimal time and effort. "She's becoming too dependent on you, and it's not healthy for either of you." This narrative was particularly effective because it appealed to David's desire to be seen as a successful, independent adult who had moved beyond the need for family support or obligation. Rebecca convinced him that my requests for assistance were signs of my failure to adapt to modern life, rather than normal aspects of family relationships that provided opportunities for mutual care and connection. But Rebecca's redefinition of our family dynamics went beyond simple criticism of my requests for help. She had begun to position herself as the expert on what was normal for elderly people and what kind of assistance was appropriate for adult children to provide to aging parents. "Most people your mother's age have learned to use rideshare apps instead of expecting family members to provide transportation," Rebecca would tell David when I asked for rides to evening events. "And there are so many services available now for grocery delivery and household maintenance that she really shouldn't need to rely on you for those kinds of things." This commentary was designed to make David feel that my needs were excessive compared to other elderly people, and that my requests for family support indicated some kind of personal failing rather than normal preferences for maintaining family connections and avoiding commercial services when family assistance was available. Rebecca had also become increasingly bold about suggesting that my lifestyle choices were inappropriate for someone my age, and that I should consider more suitable living arrangements that would reduce the burden on David while providing me with the kind of structured support that she claimed was necessary for elderly people. "Has your mother ever considered senior living communities?" Rebecca had asked David during a family dinner 6 months before my birthday. "Some of my friends' parents have made that transition and found it really liberating to have services available without having to ask family members for help all the time." The suggestion that I should move to a senior living facility wasn't based on any assessment of my actual needs or capabilities. It was part of Rebecca's long-term strategy to remove me from close proximity to David and our family assets, while positioning herself as the primary decision-maker regarding my care and welfare. But perhaps the most manipulative aspect of Rebecca's power strategy was her use of generational differences to make my preferences and concerns seem outdated and irrelevant to modern family functioning. She would dismiss my opinions about financial planning, technology, and lifestyle choices as the confused perspectives of someone who didn't understand contemporary realities. "Your mother grew up in a different era," Rebecca would tell David when I expressed concerns about their spending habits or financial planning. "She doesn't really understand how modern couples manage money or plan for the future." This generational framing was particularly effective because it allowed Rebecca to disregard my professional expertise in family law and financial planning by suggesting that my knowledge was obsolete, rather than acknowledging that my experience might provide valuable insights into their decisions and behavior. Rebecca had also begun to establish herself as the intermediary between David and me, gradually taking control of our communication and ensuring that most of our interactions were filtered through her interpretation and commentary. She would volunteer to relay messages, offer to help coordinate family activities, and position herself as the person who could translate between David's modern perspectives and my supposedly outdated expectations. "Let me talk to David about that," Rebecca would say whenever I wanted to discuss something with my son directly. "I think I can help him understand what you're really asking for, and find a solution that works for everyone." This intermediary role was crucial to Rebecca's overall strategy because it allowed her to control the information that David received about my requests, concerns, and feelings, while ensuring that her interpretation of family dynamics became the primary framework for understanding our relationships. But the most dangerous aspect of Rebecca's power strategy was her systematic effort to convince David that my emotional reactions to her behavior were signs of mental or psychological decline rather than legitimate responses to her manipulation and disrespect. When I expressed frustration about being excluded from family decisions, Rebecca would suggest to David that I was having difficulty adjusting to changes and that my reactions were disproportionate to the actual circumstances. When I questioned Rebecca's involvement in our family's financial discussions, she would characterize my concerns as quote, 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 quote. I think your mother is having some anxiety about getting older, Rebecca had told David after I had questioned why she needed copies of my insurance documents. It's really common for elderly people to become suspicious about family members who are just trying to help. This psychological reframing was particularly insidious because it transformed my legitimate concerns about Rebecca's behavior into evidence of my declining mental competence, making it less likely that David would take my warning seriously, and more likely that he would view Rebecca's involvement as necessary protection for someone who was becoming confused and paranoid. Rebecca had also established herself as the family expert on elderly care and aging issues, regularly sharing articles and information about senior health, cognitive decline, and family caregiving that reinforced her narrative about my increasing needs and David's responsibilities as my adult child. I've been reading about the signs of early dementia Rebecca had mentioned during a recent family gathering, and I think we should pay attention to any changes in your mother's behavior or decision-making abilities. This pseudo-medical expertise allowed Rebecca to pathologize normal aging processes and occasional forgetfulness as potential signs of serious cognitive decline that required family intervention and oversight. She was building a foundation for future claims that I was becoming incompetent to manage my own affairs, and that she and David needed to take more active roles in protecting my welfare and assets. But perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of Rebecca's power strategy was her use of social expectations and gender roles to make her manipulation appear caring and appropriate rather than predatory and self-interested. Rebecca presented herself as the dutiful daughter-in-law who was stepping up to help care for an aging family member, drawing on cultural narratives about women's natural caregiving abilities and family responsibilities. She volunteered for tasks that made her appear generous and thoughtful, while providing her with access to information and influence that could be used to advance her long-term goals. I don't mind helping Margaret with her errands and appointments, Rebecca would tell people when describing her involvement in my life. Family takes care of family, and I want David to know that I'm committed to supporting the people who are important to him. Quote, this public performance of family devotion was particularly effective because it made anyone who questioned Rebecca's motives appear suspicious and ungrateful. How could anyone criticize someone who was voluntarily spending time and energy helping an elderly family member with practical needs and daily activities? But Rebecca's performance of family care was always strategic rather than genuine. Her offers of help were designed to provide her with access to my financial information, medical records, and personal affairs, rather than to improve my quality of life or reduce my stress. Her expressions of concern about my welfare were calculated to position her as an indispensable family member, rather than to address any real problems or challenges I was experiencing. The social events and family gatherings where Rebecca performed her role as caring daughter-in-law were particularly important to her overall strategy because they provided opportunities to demonstrate her value to our family while documenting what she claimed were signs of my increasing confusion and dependency. During holiday dinners and birthday celebrations, Rebecca would publicly offer to help me with tasks that I could handle independently, creating the impression that I needed assistance while positioning herself as the family member who was attentive to my needs and limitations. Let me help you with that, Margaret, Rebecca would say whenever I was serving food or organizing activities, even when her help wasn't needed or wanted. I know these big family gatherings can be overwhelming. These public offers of assistance served multiple purposes in Rebecca's manipulation strategy. They made her appear caring and attentive to observers who didn't understand that her help was unwanted and unnecessary. They created the impression that I was struggling with tasks that should be simple for someone my age. Most importantly, they established Rebecca as the family member who was most involved in my care and most knowledgeable about my supposed limitations and needs. Rebecca had also begun to establish herself as the family historian and memory keeper, volunteering to organize family photographs, maintain contact lists, and coordinate social activities in ways that gave her control over our family narrative and our relationships with extended family and friends. "I've been thinking we should create a family photo album for Margaret," Rebecca had suggested during one of our gatherings. "It would be a nice way to preserve memories, and I could help organize everything, since I know how overwhelming these projects can be for older people." This offer to help with family documentation was actually an opportunity for Rebecca to gain access to historical information about our family relationships, financial history, and social connections that could be useful for her long-term manipulation strategy. By positioning herself as the organizer of family memories, Rebecca was also establishing herself as the person who would control how our family story was told and preserved. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of Rebecca's power strategy was her systematic effort to exclude me from decision-making processes that affected our family's future, while making her exclusion appear natural and appropriate, rather than deliberate and manipulative. Rebecca had begun to plan family activities, coordinate social events, and make suggestions about our relationships with other family members without consulting me or including me in the decision-making process. When I questioned these arrangements or expressed different preferences, Rebecca would suggest that I was being difficult, or that my input wasn't necessary for decisions that primarily affected David and her. "We thought it would be easier to just handle the planning ourselves," Rebecca would say when I discovered that family events had been organized without my knowledge or input. "We didn't want to burden you with all the details and logistics." This exclusion from family planning and decision-making was presented as consideration for my comfort and convenience, but it was actually a systematic effort to reduce my influence over our family's activities and relationships, while establishing Rebecca as the primary decision-maker for anything that affected our future interactions. The birthday party at the Riverside Country Club represented the culmination of Rebecca's 3-year campaign to establish herself as the dominant force in our family relationships, while reducing me to the role of elderly dependent who required management rather than respect. Rebecca had volunteered to organize my 70th birthday celebration, presenting this as a generous gift that would relieve me of the stress and complexity of planning a significant milestone event. But her control over the planning process also meant that she could structure the celebration in ways that would serve her manipulation strategy, while appearing to honor and celebrate my life and achievements. The guest list for my birthday party had been carefully curated by Rebecca to include people who would support her narrative about my increasing dependency and her indispensable role in our family's functioning. She had invited colleagues from David's work, friends from her social circle, and extended family members who didn't know me well enough to recognize that her characterizations of my limitations were exaggerated and self-serving. "I thought it would be nice to have a mix of people from different parts of Margaret's life," Rebecca had explained when David asked about the invitation list. "Some of the guests might not know each other, but that will give everyone a chance to share their memories and celebrate all the different ways Margaret has touched people's lives." But the guest list was actually designed to include people who would witness Rebecca's performance of family devotion, while lacking the historical knowledge or personal relationships that would allow them to recognize her behavior as manipulation rather than genuine care. Rebecca had also structured the evening's activities to provide multiple opportunities for her to demonstrate her knowledge of my preferences, her attention to my needs, and her role as the family member who was most responsible for ensuring my comfort and happiness. The venue selection, menu planning, and entertainment arrangements had all been presented as evidence of Rebecca's thoughtfulness and her understanding of what would make my birthday celebration memorable and meaningful. But these decisions had actually been made to serve Rebecca's social and strategic goals, rather than my personal preferences or genuine interests. "I chose the Riverside Country Club because I know Margaret appreciates elegant settings," Rebecca had told the gathered guests during her toast, "and I wanted to make sure everything was perfect for someone who has given so much to our family." This public acknowledgement of my contributions to our family appeared generous and appropriate, but it was actually part of Rebecca's strategy to position herself as the person who truly understood and appreciated my value, while subtly suggesting that my active contributions were primarily in the past rather than the present. The gift presentation was going to be the climax of Rebecca's performance, the moment when she would demonstrate her complete control over our family dynamics, while revealing exactly how little respect she actually had for the woman whose wealth and sacrifices had made her comfortable lifestyle possible. Rebecca had planned the gift presentation to occur in front of all the gathered guests, ensuring that her humiliation of me would be witnessed by people whose opinions mattered to our social standing and family reputation. She wanted the maximum possible audience for her demonstration of power and her revelation of contempt. But what Rebecca didn't understand was that her public humiliation of me wasn't going to be the triumph she had planned. It was going to be the mistake that exposed her true character to everyone present and provided me with the perfect opportunity to demonstrate what happened when someone with her motivations chose to target someone with my background, resources, and determination to ensure that family predators faced consequences they would never forget. The dirty broom she was planning to present as my birthday gift wasn't going to be a symbol of her power over our family relationships. It was going to become the evidence that would destroy her life and demonstrate to everyone present exactly what kind of person they had been watching manipulate and exploit an elderly family member. Rebecca thought she had established herself as the dominant force in our family dynamics, but she was about to discover that all of her manipulation and power building had been observed, documented, and analyzed by someone who understood exactly what she was attempting to accomplish, and who had the resources and expertise needed to ensure that her schemes resulted in her complete and permanent destruction. The evening of October 14th, 2023, started like any other Saturday, with no indication that by midnight Rebecca would be in federal custody and her entire life would be destroyed by consequences she never saw coming. But every detail of what happened that night at the Riverside Country Club, from Rebecca's calculated humiliation to her moment of ultimate betrayal to the swift and devastating justice that followed, needs to be understood completely, because this wasn't just a story about a birthday party gone wrong. This was a masterclass in what happens when someone fundamentally underestimates their victim and discovers too late that some people are far more dangerous than they appear. The celebration began at 6:30 p.m., with 37 guests arriving at the private dining room that Rebecca had reserved for what she had advertised as, quote, an elegant celebration of Margaret's 70 years of life and achievement. The guest list included David's colleagues from his pharmaceutical company, several of Rebecca's friends from her sales territory, extended family members who had traveled from Wisconsin and Iowa, and neighbors from my Lincoln Park community who had known me for decades. The venue itself was magnificent, exactly the kind of sophisticated setting that would have been perfect for celebrating a significant milestone birthday if the celebration had been motivated by genuine love and appreciation rather than calculated manipulation and public humiliation. The Riverside Country Club's private dining room featured floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago River, elegant table settings with fresh flowers and fine china, and discreet lighting that created an atmosphere of warmth and sophistication. Rebecca had clearly invested substantial time and money in creating an event that would impress the guests and reinforce her image as a thoughtful, devoted daughter-in-law who understood the importance of properly honoring an elderly family member's significant birthday. The menu featured upscale cuisine, premium wines, and a custom birthday cake that had been decorated with elegant script and fresh flowers. But I recognized immediately that every aspect of the evening had been designed to serve Rebecca's manipulation strategy rather than to celebrate my actual preferences or accomplishments. The guest list included people who would be impressed by Rebecca's performance, while lacking the personal knowledge of our family that would allow them to recognize her behavior as calculated rather than genuine. The venue, while beautiful, was more expensive and formal than necessary for a family birthday celebration, suggesting that Rebecca was using the event to demonstrate her financial resources and social sophistication, rather than to create an atmosphere where family members could relax and enjoy meaningful connections. Most tellingly, the evening's timeline and activities had been structured to provide Rebecca with multiple opportunities to demonstrate her knowledge of my preferences, her attention to my needs, and her role as the family member who was most responsible for ensuring my comfort and happiness. I want to make sure this evening is everything Margaret deserves, Rebecca announced to the assembled guests during her opening remarks. She's been such an important part of our family, and I wanted to create a celebration that reflects how much we all appreciate her contributions to our lives. This public acknowledgement of my importance to our family appeared generous and appropriate, but I could hear the past tense in Rebecca's language. has been rather than is, suggesting that she viewed my contributions as historical rather than ongoing, and my value as commemorative rather than current. During the cocktail hour, Rebecca moved through the room, introducing me to guests who didn't know me well, providing commentary about my background and achievements that was designed to reinforce her narrative about my advancing age and increasing dependency on family support. Margaret had such an impressive career as an attorney, Rebecca would say to David's colleagues, but she's really enjoying her retirement now and focusing on simpler pleasures like spending time with family. The characterization of my current life as focused on simpler pleasures was clearly designed to suggest that I had moved beyond serious professional or intellectual activities and was now content with the kind of basic social interactions that Rebecca deemed appropriate for someone my age. But perhaps most revealing was Rebecca's systematic effort to position herself as the expert on my preferences, my health concerns, and my emotional needs, providing commentary to guests about my supposedly declining capabilities, while presenting herself as the family member who was most knowledgeable about my current limitations. Margaret sometimes gets a little overwhelmed in large social situations, Rebecca confided to several guests, so I'm keeping an eye on her energy level to make sure she's comfortable throughout the evening. This false concern about my social stamina was designed to make Rebecca appear attentive and caring, while creating the impression that I was becoming frail and confused in ways that required family oversight and protection. During dinner, Rebecca continued her performance of devoted family care, offering to help me with tasks that I could handle independently and making comments about my dietary preferences and health considerations that reinforced her image as someone who was intimately involved in managing my daily welfare. I made sure the chef prepared Margaret's salmon without too much seasoning, Rebecca announced to the table, because I know she has to be careful about sodium intake at her age. This commentary about my supposed dietary restrictions was completely fabricated. I had no health conditions that required sodium limitations, but it served Rebecca's strategy of demonstrating her knowledge of my supposed medical needs while reinforcing the impression that my health required careful monitoring and family intervention. But the most calculated aspect of Rebecca's performance was her systematic effort to gather information about my financial situation and estate planning from guests who might have knowledge about my professional background or current circumstances. During conversations with my former colleagues from Thornfield, Morrison Associates, Rebecca asked detailed questions about my retirement benefits, my investment portfolio, and my plans for managing my estate that were presented as caring concern but were actually intelligence gathering about assets she hoped to eventually control. I hope Margaret is finding retirement financially comfortable, Rebecca had said to Patricia Walsh, a junior partner at my former firm. David and I want to make sure she has everything she needs, but we don't always know how to help with the complex financial planning that someone in her position requires. Quote, "This fishing expedition for financial information was disguised as family concern, but Patricia's response revealed that Rebecca had dramatically underestimated both my financial resources and my continued professional competence." "Oh, Margaret doesn't need any help with financial planning," Patricia had replied with obvious surprise at Rebecca's suggestion. "She's probably the most sophisticated estate planning attorney in Illinois, and her investment portfolio is substantial enough that she could live comfortably for several lifetimes." Rebecca's expression when she received this information was priceless, a mixture of shock, calculation, and poorly concealed greed that revealed exactly how she viewed my value to her long-term financial security. But Rebecca quickly recovered her composure and continued gathering intelligence about my professional background and current capabilities, apparently hoping to find evidence that would support her narrative about my declining competence and increasing need for family oversight. "Well, I'm sure all that legal expertise is wonderful," Rebecca had responded to Patricia, "but David and I worry that Margaret might not be staying current with modern financial strategies and technology that could help optimize her situation." This suggestion that my professional expertise was obsolete was immediately contradicted by Patricia's explanation of my consulting work and my continued involvement in complex legal cases that required cutting-edge knowledge of financial crime investigation and digital forensics. "Actually, Margaret's consulting practice is busier than ever," Patricia had explained. "She's working on several major inheritance fraud cases that require the kind of advanced investigative techniques that most attorneys couldn't handle. Her expertise is definitely not outdated. If anything, she's ahead of most practitioners in understanding how modern technology can be used to investigate financial crimes." The conversation with Patricia was clearly not providing Rebecca with the information she had hoped to gather, so she shifted her strategy to gathering intelligence about my personal relationships and social connections that might be relevant to her long-term manipulation plans. As the evening progressed toward the gift presentation that Rebecca had planned as the climax of her performance, I could see her confidence building as she prepared to execute what she clearly believed would be a devastating public humiliation that would establish her dominance over our family relationships, while demonstrating her contempt for the woman whose sacrifices had made her lifestyle possible. The gift presentation was scheduled to occur after dinner, when all the guests would be settled and focused on the evening's formal program. Rebecca had arranged for the lights to be dimmed and for attention to be focused on the gift table, where she had placed a carefully wrapped package that she clearly expected would shock and humiliate me in front of everyone present. "Ladies and gentlemen," Rebecca announced as she moved to the front of the room, "I'd like to take a moment to present Margaret with a very special birthday gift that I think perfectly captures her current stage of life and the role she plays in our family." The phrasing of this introduction was clearly designed to maximize the impact of whatever humiliation Rebecca had planned. The reference to my current stage of life and my role in our family suggested that the gift would be commentary on my advancing age and my supposed diminished status within our family relationships. As Rebecca began unwrapping the gift, I could see the anticipation and barely concealed excitement on her face as she prepared to reveal what she clearly believed would be the perfect expression of her contempt and the ultimate demonstration of her power over our family dynamics. When Rebecca pulled away the wrapping paper to reveal a dirty, used broom, clearly something she had retrieved from a utility closet or cleaning supplies storage area, the collective gasp from the assembled guests was audible and immediate. The broom itself was obviously old and well-used, with frayed bristles, stains on the handle, and an overall appearance that suggested it had been used for cleaning bathrooms or outdoor areas, rather than for any household task that would be appropriate for someone to handle. "I thought this would be perfect for you, Margaret," Rebecca announced to the stunned and increasingly uncomfortable guests, "because it's time for you to start cleaning up the messes you've made in our family relationships and stop expecting other people to take care of everything for you." Quote, "The cruelty and calculation behind this gift was so obvious and so shocking that several guests immediately began to express their discomfort and disapproval, but Rebecca continued her humiliation with obvious satisfaction and complete confidence that she was demonstrating her dominance, rather than revealing her own character flaws. David and I have decided that you need to take more responsibility for maintaining your own household and stop relying on family members to solve problems that you should be handling independently," Rebecca continued, her voice carrying the same condescending tone she had been using with me for 3 years. "This broom represents a new chapter in your life where you learn to clean up after yourself instead of expecting other people to manage your affairs." The silence that followed Rebecca's explanation was profound and uncomfortable, as guests struggled to process what they had just witnessed, and to understand how someone could publicly humiliate an elderly family member with such calculated cruelty and obvious satisfaction. But what Rebecca didn't understand was that her moment of triumph was actually the moment when she revealed her true character so completely that everyone present could recognize her behavior as calculated elder abuse, rather than legitimate family boundary setting. The gift presentation wasn't demonstrating Rebecca's power over our family relationships. It was providing incontrovertible evidence of her predatory behavior and her systematic campaign to humiliate and exploit an elderly family member who had never done anything to deserve such treatment. More importantly, Rebecca's public humiliation of me had just provided the perfect opportunity to demonstrate what happened when someone with her character flaws chose to target someone with my background, resources, and determination to ensure that family predators faced consequences they would never forget. As I stood there holding the dirty broom that Rebecca had presented as my 70th birthday gift, I could feel the shock and disapproval radiating from the guests who had witnessed her calculated cruelty. But I could also feel something else, a sense of clarity and purpose that came from finally having undeniable proof of Rebecca's true character and the perfect justification for using every legal weapon at my disposal to destroy her completely. "Thank you, Rebecca," I said in a voice that was calm and controlled despite the rage building inside me. "This is certainly a revealing gift that tells everyone present exactly who you really are, and what you think of the family relationships that have provided you with everything you have." My response clearly wasn't what Rebecca had expected. She had anticipated tears, humiliation, or confused acceptance that would reinforce her narrative about my declining competence and emotional fragility. Instead, she was hearing the measured tone of someone who was analyzing her behavior and preparing a response. "I think it's time for everyone to understand exactly what kind of person we've been watching manipulate and exploit an elderly family member," I continued, my voice growing stronger and more authoritative with each word. "Because Rebecca's gift tonight isn't just cruel, it's also criminal evidence of a systematic campaign of elder abuse that I've been documenting for 18 months. The change in atmosphere was immediate and electric. Guests who had been uncomfortable but confused were now alert and focused, recognizing that something far more serious than family dysfunction was being revealed. You see, Rebecca made a critical mistake when she chose to target me for inheritance fraud," I explained to the assembled guests, who were now completely silent and absorbed in what was becoming a dramatic revelation rather than a birthday celebration. "She assumed that I was a confused elderly widow who didn't understand modern financial systems and who would be grateful for family help with complex decisions. But what Rebecca never bothered to discover is that the woman she's been manipulating is actually Margaret Thornfield, senior partner at Thornfield, Morrison Associates, and one of Illinois' most experienced inheritance fraud prosecutors." The shock on Rebecca's face was immediate and complete. For the first time since I had known her, she was speechless and visibly panicked, as she began to understand that her manipulation strategy had just been exposed to everyone present. "For the past 18 months, I've been working with private investigators and federal authorities to document Rebecca's systematic campaign to gain control over my assets through manipulation, isolation, and elder abuse," I continued, pulling out my phone to show the recorded evidence that had been streaming live to FBI servers throughout the evening. Every conversation, every suggestion about my supposed confusion, every attempt to gain access to my financial information has been documented and analyzed as part of a comprehensive investigation into inheritance fraud and family exploitation. David, who had been sitting in stunned silence since Rebecca's gift presentation, finally found his voice. "Mom, what are you talking about? Rebecca's been trying to help you. She cares about our family. David, your wife has been systematically manipulating you for 3 years as part of a calculated scheme to gain control over my estate," I replied, my voice carrying the authority of someone who had prosecuted hundreds of similar cases. "She married you because she researched my financial situation and decided that gaining access to my inheritance was worth 3 years of performance and manipulation." The evidence I had been collecting was comprehensive and devastating. Rebecca's communications with her sister about maximizing the inheritance and ensuring I didn't live long enough to spend everything. Her systematic attempts to gain access to my financial accounts and medical records. Her campaign to convince David that I was becoming confused and dependent in ways that required family intervention. But perhaps most damning was the recording equipment that had been capturing everything Rebecca said and did during the birthday party, including her explicit statement that it was time for me to start cleaning up the messes I'd made, and her demand that I stop expecting other people to take care of everything. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced to the guests, "you've just witnessed a perfect example of elder abuse and inheritance fraud. Rebecca's gift tonight wasn't just cruel. It was evidence of criminal activity that carries serious federal penalties." As if on cue, federal agents who had been stationed outside the country club entered the dining room and approached Rebecca with arrest warrants that had been prepared based on the evidence collected during our 18-month investigation. "Rebecca Chen Morrison, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit inheritance fraud, elder abuse, and financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult," Agent Sarah Martinez announced as she placed handcuffs on Rebecca, who had gone completely pale and appeared to be in shock. The charges against Rebecca were comprehensive and devastating. Federal conspiracy charges for her systematic campaign to gain control over my assets. State elder abuse charges for her manipulation and humiliation. Financial fraud charges for her unauthorized access to my accounts and information. Identity theft charges for her use of my personal information to conduct background research and financial analysis. But the criminal charges were only the beginning of Rebecca's destruction. The investigation had also revealed that her apparent financial independence was built on credit card fraud, employment expense account theft, and personal loans that she had obtained using false information about her income and assets. Rebecca's employer was immediately notified about her criminal activity and her systematic theft of company resources, resulting in her termination and referral for additional criminal prosecution. Her professional licenses and certifications were suspended, pending resolution of the criminal cases. Most devastatingly, the publicity surrounding Rebecca's arrest destroyed her carefully constructed image and social standing. Local news media covered the story extensively, focusing on the shocking details of a woman who had married into a family specifically to steal inheritance from an elderly mother-in-law who had built a successful legal career protecting people from exactly the kind of exploitation Rebecca had attempted. The story resonated with audiences because it represented every family's worst nightmare about manipulative relatives who target elderly family members for financial gain. Rebecca became a symbol of generational greed and family betrayal that generated widespread public condemnation and disgust. Her expensive lifestyle, designer clothing, and luxury purchases were all revealed to be financed through fraud and debt rather than legitimate income. Her professional accomplishments were exposed as exaggerated claims that had been used to manipulate David and justify her access to our family's financial information. But perhaps the most personally devastating consequence for Rebecca was the complete destruction of her relationship with David, who finally understood that everything about their marriage had been calculated deception designed to facilitate theft from his mother. The evidence of Rebecca's manipulation was so overwhelming and her criminal activity so extensively documented that David's attorney advised him to file for divorce immediately and to cooperate fully with federal prosecutors to avoid any suggestion that he had been complicit in her schemes. Rebecca's trial became a comprehensive demonstration of how completely she had misjudged the woman she chose to target. The evidence against her was so overwhelming and well documented that her attorney advised her to plead guilty to all charges, rather than risk even harsher sentences that would result from a trial. During the sentencing hearing, I was given the opportunity to provide a victim impact statement that detailed the psychological manipulation Rebecca had used and the systematic way she had attempted to destroy my relationship with David while positioning herself to steal assets I had accumulated through 42 years of legal practice. Your Honor, I said, addressing the federal judge who would determine Rebecca's punishment, the defendant didn't just attempt to steal money from an elderly woman. She systematically manipulated my son, exploited our family relationships, and attempted to destroy the bonds of love and trust that are the foundation of family life. She chose greed over basic human decency, and she needs to face consequences that will deter others from similar crimes. The judge's response was swift and decisive. Rebecca was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for the inheritance fraud and conspiracy charges, followed by 8 years of supervised probation, during which she would be required to pay full restitution for all costs associated with the investigation and prosecution of her crimes. The financial restitution alone would consume any income Rebecca might earn for decades after her release, ensuring that she would never again be able to afford the luxury lifestyle that had been more important to her than family relationships or basic honesty. But the most fitting aspect of Rebecca's punishment was that she would serve her sentence in a federal facility where she would be surrounded by other criminals who had destroyed their lives through greed, manipulation, and fundamental failures of character. Rebecca would have 12 years to think about the choices that had led her from pharmaceutical sales representative to convicted felon, and to understand exactly what she had lost when she chose to target someone who had built her career around protecting elderly people from predators exactly like her. Today, 5 months after Rebecca's conviction, I continue to live independently in my Lincoln Park home, running my consulting practice and overseeing the Margaret Thornfield Foundation for Elder Justice, a charitable organization I established to provide legal assistance and investigation services for elderly people who have been targeted by family members or caregivers who forgot that love and respect are not optional components of family relationships. David has worked hard to rebuild our relationship and to understand how Rebecca's manipulation affected his perceptions of our family dynamics. He's undergone counseling to address the psychological impact of discovering that his marriage was based entirely on deception and greed, and he's committed to ensuring that our family never again becomes vulnerable to the kind of exploitation that Rebecca attempted. Rebecca remains in federal prison, where, according to reports from her case managers, she spends most of her time in the library reading books about family relationships and personal responsibility, subjects that she apparently never studied when such knowledge might have prevented her crimes. I receive occasional letters from Rebecca expressing remorse and asking for forgiveness, but I do not respond to these communications. Some betrayals are too fundamental to overcome, and attempting to humiliate someone at their own birthday celebration while systematically stealing their inheritance is certainly one of them. The most important lesson I learned from this experience is that family relationships do not automatically create immunity from consequences when someone chooses to commit serious crimes. When Rebecca handed me that dirty broom at my birthday party, she transformed our relationship from family members to victim and perpetrator, which meant that all of my professional capabilities could be applied without the emotional limitations that had previously protected her. Rebecca learned, too late, that underestimating someone based on age and family relationships can be a devastating mistake. She thought she was humiliating a helpless elderly woman who would probably accept the abuse and continue providing financial opportunities. Instead, she provided someone with 42 years of inheritance fraud prosecution experience, with the motivation and justification needed to ensure that she faced maximum consequences for her crimes. The Riverside Country Club still hosts birthday celebrations and family gatherings, and the staff still remembers the night when a pharmaceutical sales representative thought she could publicly humiliate a retired attorney and learned that some mistakes cost more than you can ever afford to pay. And me? I'm living exactly the life I deserve. Free, independent, secure, and surrounded by people who understand that true wealth isn't money or professional success. It's integrity, gratitude, and the knowledge that you've used your life to make the world a little safer for vulnerable people who need protection from those who would exploit them. That's a legacy worth building, and it's a legacy that no one can ever steal from you, no matter how hard they try. The dirty broom Rebecca thought would humiliate me has become a symbol in my office. A reminder that some people reveal their true character so completely that they provide you with everything you need to ensure they face the consequences they deserve. That elegant birthday party at the Riverside Country Club wasn't just the location of Rebecca's criminal behavior. It was the moment when she discovered that choosing greed over gratitude and cruelty over compassion can result in consequences that last far longer than she ever imagined. Justice isn't always swift, but when it comes, it's usually more complete than the criminals expect. Rebecca discovered that truth the hard way, and now the world knows exactly what happens when someone chooses to betray the trust of a family member who spent her career making sure that predators like her faced the full weight of the law. The woman Rebecca thought she could humiliate and exploit became her worst nightmare, and every day for the next 12 years, when Rebecca wakes up in her federal prison cell, she'll have the opportunity to think about what her life might have been like if she had simply treated her husband's mother with the basic respect and consideration that every human being deserves. That dirty broom wasn't a gift. It was the evidence that destroyed her life and proved that some people are far more dangerous than they appear. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.